So how to build a case. So I'm going to try and move through quickly. So this is a strategy for building cases that we think is really helpful and works in a lot of different scenarios. You don't have to do it this way. If this is unhelpful to you, again, it's not a rule that this is the way that you have to debate, but this is a framework that we find really helpful for thinking about how to build cases for debating. So it's called PMSO, Problem, Model, Solution, Outcomes. I'm going to explain each of those different things, but basically it's a tool for thinking about how to come up with ideas for debates, how to come up with your overall reasons, how to come up with the thing that you support in the debate. Okay, so firstly, problem. What is the specific problem? And you don't have to necessarily answer every single one of these questions in every debate. I would recommend that these are the things that you're thinking about in the prep room and that some of these things translate into your first speaker speech. So what's the problem in the debate? Normally a debate is set because we think that there is something that maybe is a problem or that some people believe is a problem in society that could be potentially fixed by whatever the topic is about. So the first question then is, what is that problem? Why are we having this debate? What's the impetus for this argument to even exist? And the questions you want to be asking are, 5 W's or whatever it is that you probably learned about in primary school. So who's involved? How are they affected? What is the problem specifically? Why does the problem exist is a really important question. Like, what is it that causes this to be an issue? Because if you don't understand why the problem exists, then sometimes it's hard to prove that you're going to actually solve the problem, because if that reason still exists and you don't solve that underlying reason, sometimes the problem can just reoccur. So why does the problem exist? Understanding that is about understanding how does it happen, where does it happen, when does it happen? And then the next thing is thinking about the scale of the problem, right? How big is the problem? How many people are affected by the problem? Is it a small impact on a big group of people? Maybe it's a big impact on a small group of people. Maybe it's a big impact on a big group of people. So asking those who, what, why, where, when, how questions about understanding the problem in the debate. Okay. The second thing is model, so problem, model. Model is a bit of debating jargon, which basically means what are you going to do about it? So what steps do you think we should take to solve the problem? So the kinds of questions you need to be asking are, who will take those steps? If the debate is about that we should all be vegan, maybe it's just that you think that everybody in society should just choose to be vegan because it's the right thing to do. It's going to be everyone in the whole world. Except for people who medically can't or something. It's okay to make exceptions in your model as long as they're about, reasonable small details that most people would agree is a reasonable exception. If your model was we should all be vegans apart from people who really don't want to, you're not really debating the argument, the main idea. One thing to think about when you're thinking about whether the exceptions that you're implementing are fair or not is to think about, does this undercut the arguments that I'm about to make? So if you make heaps and heaps of exceptions, it's going to be hard to prove that you have any impact if very few people are even doing the thing that you support. So exceptions are a double-edged sword because sometimes it can feel like, oh, I don't want to have to argue about every single example, but on the other hand, if you make it so that hardly anyone is actually doing what you support, it can be hard to prove that the impact of that thing is actually very big. So who will take these steps? Maybe it's the government, maybe it's society, maybe it's your individual school or all the schools in New Zealand or the Ministry of Education. You might want to ask, when will they take these steps? Right away, 10 years from now? Only if there's an emergency, if it was a debate about something to do with emergencies. Where is this a debate that takes place? in New Zealand? Is it a debate that takes place in the whole world? Is it a debate that takes place in the developed world? Those kinds of questions are not important in every single debate, but they can be important in some debates. So uh, something that is really important when you're developing a model, when you're trying to think of what it is that you're actually going to do, is to think about, is this going to be a really easy thing to do? Is it going to be a really hard thing to do? It's okay if it's going to be difficult. You just have to prove that it's worth that difficulty. And it's often easier to prove that it's worth a lot of difficulty if you're upfront. If you say, we acknowledge that it's going to be pretty hard to do this, but we think it's really important, and I'm going to explain why it's really important next. You want to paint a picture of what the world looks like. One thing that's really important is that people often stress out about thinking, oh, well, I don't actually know how much it would realistically cost the New Zealand government to overhaul the education system. So how am I going to build a model about this education debate? That's fine. Nobody expects you to have a detailed understanding of the government's expenditure policy on education. Just a rough idea of whether you think that this is a big change or a small change, if you think it's easy or hard. And the way to get to that is to think about, is there anything else that you can think of that's similar? And how did people feel about that similar change? So maybe if you were doing a debate about whether school in New Zealand should be bilingual in English and in Te Reo Māori, maybe you might think, well, I know that in Wales they have some bilingual schools and that was really difficult, but it's been pretty successful. Or you might think about, well, it's already been pretty difficult to get even some level of Te Reo Māori in some schools because there's a shortage of teachers. So think about what are other comparable policies or similar things. It doesn't even have to really be that similar. Those can just be ways to point yourself in the right direction about your model. Okay, any questions about models or the problem so far? Nope. Okay, solution. So how does your model solve that problem? The easiest way to do this is to start with the things that you outlined in the problem and then match up to each of those different things how each of those things is solved by taking the action that you took. So the best thing to do is to start with the reason that you gave as to why the problem existed. We told you that if we were thinking about the bilingual schools debate, you might say the problem in the debate is that not enough New Zealanders speak Te Reo Māori and we're losing the taonga, and in particular not enough people who aren't Māori speak it, and that means that it's really hard for it to be as important as it should be in New Zealand culture and society because everyone should respect and understand Te Reo Māori. And then the model is that we're going to make sure that we have bilingual schools. Every school is going to teach bilingually. It's going to happen we're going to transition over the next 10 years to make sure that we can train up enough teachers. It's going to be really difficult, but we think it's worth it. Sorry. And then the solution, you're going to say, so that will solve that problem because it will mean that every person in New Zealand has a baseline understanding of how to speak conversational Te Reo Māori and how to do basic technical language skills, because every person will have had an education, regardless of whether they have connection to people who already speak the language to be able to teach them. So the solution part is about explaining how you solved the problem that you outlined at the beginning of the debate. Okay, and then outcomes is the last section, and that's where you describe the benefits of solving the problem. This is really important. People often forget to really explain why it matters that they solved the problem. And this is how you explain to an adjudicator why they should care about all the other things that you said. If you prove that you solved the problem, but you don't convince the adjudicator that it's actually a problem worth solving, it's going to be hard to win the debate. So what are some things to think about in terms of outcomes? That's short-term versus long-term effects, direct versus indirect effects. So maybe a direct effect would be that more people have a connection to Te Ao Māori and to an understanding of tikanga, and that's enriching to a lot of people's lives and makes their lives better. And an indirect impact might be that there's less stigma around Māori speaking in Te Reo because everybody in New Zealand speaks Te Reo and there's not that kind of stigmatization. So what are the effects on the broader community? What are the effects on the specific community? And this is an opportunity again for you to try and utilize rhetoric skills, examples, persuasive language and speaking to make the adjudicator really care about the outcomes of this point. So problem, what's the problem? What are you going to do about it? How does that solve the problem? And then what's the benefit of solving that problem? Okay. I'm just gonna So sometimes, anybody have any questions about PMSO before I move on? Nope, okay. Need cases, sometimes you can use problem model solution outcome for need cases. Sometimes you can't, just doesn't really quite make sense for the debate. You'll kind of get a sense of that when you see the motions. But here are some tactics for neg cases, and it follows the same steps as problem model solution outcome. The first is that arguing that there's no problem in the debate, that the status quo is fine. The second is arguing that there is a problem, but their model doesn't actually solve that problem at all. So it's not worth doing because it's a waste of time and money. The third is that their solution might solve the problem, but there's another better way to do it. So maybe in the debate about bilingualism, you might say, well, yes, it might help, but we think it's more important to focus resources on tikanga Māori schools to make sure that people who most value the language, who most value te reo and tikanga should have the best possible access to it, rather than spreading our resources really thin. So maybe you solve the problem, but there's a better solution, a better way to spend that time and those resources. The fourth thing that you can do is to argue that maybe you solve that problem, but it's not worth it because there's a lot of negative impacts or negative side effects as a result of doing that thing. So you solve the problem, but the thing that happens instead is way worse than the original problem. And you don't necessarily have to do only one of those things. You can do a combination. You can say the problem's not really that bad and the model doesn't really solve the problem. And anyway, there's heaps of negative side effects to doing that. But yeah, so it's still that same framework, problem, model, solution, outcomes, but it's just thinking about each of those things independently and flipping them around. So there isn't a problem, maybe there is a problem, but your model doesn't solve it. Maybe it does solve it, but the outcomes outweigh it. And it's really important as a team that you all kind of agree or have a sense of which of those strategies you're taking, because sometimes on the neg, it can be tempting to just be a dog that barks at every passing car and just disagree with every single thing that the other team says, even if that undermines your own point. So if your argument is that there's another better solution to the problem, and you spend heaps of time arguing that the problem isn't really important, it's hard for your solution to be impactful in the debate as well. Does that make sense to everybody?